All right, hi there everybody, Mr. Sapora here, and we're going to be finishing up our ecology unit today, talking about biodiversity. Woo! For that, of course, I got the lecture here, which I'm going to post, the presentation, and then I have some lecture notes sheet to fill out, and I got some critical thinking questions that I put in there, a few things you might need to look up on your own as well. So I tried to make that a little more, less just copying straight off the presentation. I have a video from Khan Academy. It's 4 minutes long about ecosystem biodiversity, kind of in a global perspective. And then I put a Google form questionnaire as well. And there's just 3 questions on that, but they're a little more critical thinking, so you're going to have to kind of grill away at that. Have a look at that, and if you have any questions, of course, you can ask those in our Monday class meeting or even on Friday when these are going to be due, these 2 assignments. And we'll have a quiz at the end of the week as well to finish up this unit. All right, enough of that. Let's get on and let's talk about biodiversity. Okay, so sort of essential questions here, and that is, what is biodiversity, right? And then why is the loss of biodiversity a concern to us, or should it be a concern to us? So we'll talk about that. Okay, so biodiversity. How would you define this term? This word gets thrown around. We hear it a lot. If you break it into its parts, of course, you should know now, hopefully, that bio, or study of biology, we're studying life. So the bio part means life, and then how would you define diversity? Diversity really means differences, right? But a range of differences. So thinking more of variety, I suppose you might think, and that leads to the idea that biodiversity in and of itself is really the variety of life. And so when we study biodiversity, we're really studying not just an individual organism, but the variety of organisms within an ecosystem. So when comparing ecosystems here on the Oregon coast, if you go out to a tide pool or an intertidal zone, you have a huge variety of life there in the tide pools, and you can really get lost just trying to identify all the different things that are out there. I'm always bringing my tide pool book whenever I go tide pooling, because I'm always going to encounter something that I probably haven't seen before, or some variety of something that I've seen before that maybe looks different, so I need to look it up. And still the case. Versus if you go to a sand dune, there's not just much variety of life there for a number of reasons. And then in our forest, we have a pretty incredible diversity of species in our temperate coniferous rainforest, especially in the larger, older forest that have more variety of structure in them. We have quite a biodiverse forest in our area, versus if you go to an area that's been recently logged and clear-cut, especially where pretty much all of the vegetation has been removed. So not just a particular population, but you're talking the whole community. And of course, if you understand energy pyramids, if you remove the producers, the consumers go with them. So you get a much lower biodiversity in those habitats. Duh. Okay. So how do we define biodiversity? Technically, it would be the number and variety of organisms. By organisms, I mean plants, animals, fungi, multi-celled stuff, but also microorganisms as well within an ecosystem or a given area. So the number and variety. So by number, I mean, I'll pull some of this up because it's an invasive grass, right? I might have, 1 million grass blades in my lawn, but it also has to be the variety. So if I only have grass, there's not much variety there. So the different number of species as well, not just I have 10 million grass blades, but if I had maybe fewer species, fewer individuals, but more species, more diversity of populations within the community, that would make something more biodiverse, and we'll talk about this. Okay, another factor when you're looking at biodiversity is the amount of genetic variation within a population in an ecosystem. So if all the individuals in the ecosystem are pretty much genetically identical, And a lot of times this happens with agriculture or with managed lands. If we are cloning one individual over and over again, especially with plants, and replanting only those exact copies of that one, a lot of ecologists and biologists might not consider that as biodiverse. So it'd be better to have more genetic variation, more variation in the population. And there's a number of reasons why this is important. One, it's for the overall health of the population. It's a genetically diverse population is able to adapt to environmental change more readily, and it also makes a population more capable to adapt to new diseases and pathogens that come through. So if everybody was genetically the same and everybody got sick when a new disease came through, it could wipe out an entire population. Imagine right now with coronavirus happening, if that virus came through and everybody, was pretty much genetically identical and everybody was susceptible to it, ended up needing to be on a respirator, we could be in a very different situation than we're in now, with a much smaller percentage of the population actually, being susceptible to it, to the degree that you need hospitalization. Anyway, so genetic diversity is important for biodiversity. All of the Earth's ecosystem collectively make up our global biodiversity. So you need to have a variety of ecosystems, and each one of those needs to have sort of a high biodiversity, or the higher the biodiversity of all of these different ecosystems. But if you only preserve one biodiverse ecosystem on the planet and not a variety of those, then globally it kind of brings the whole world's biodiversity down as well. So it's sort of this quilt, this patchwork of different species within different ecosystems that then make up the whole of the biosphere itself. There is an estimated about 7 million different eukaryotic species globally. So these are some of your larger species, plants, animals, fungus, and then there's some single-celled ones in there for sure, protists and a lot of planktons. And then bacteria and archaea, the really tiny microorganisms, make up a huge diversity as well underneath that. So more species there. But it's about 7 million, and we've counted just over 1 million right now here on Earth. So we still have a lot left to classify and name and even understand, or identify for that matter. Many times in especially tropical regions, there's a lot of areas that just haven't been explored yet on a fine detail level. When you go up into these tropical canopies and start collecting insects, in some cases, each tree can yield, half the bugs that come out of it are new to science still to this day. So we have a lot to learn and understand about global biodiversity here on Earth. And just kind of hinted to this, biodiversity globally is highest in the tropics, and we'll look at some maps of this here in a second. Okay, so biodiversity. How would you measure biodiversity? How would you measure which of these? You could look at them and kind of see which one contains more living things and more variety of living things, right? But how would you actually measure that? And scientists, it's not enough to say, well, that just looks like it, or that is. Well, how much is, right? Well, give me a number here. Give me something we can compare. Because if you have facts, then you have something that you can argue about. Otherwise, you end up sort of in the realm of opinion. And as a scientist myself, I don't feel very comfortable in that world. I like having facts, and then we can have a fact-based discussion and usually come to some type of consensus or understanding for at least what we're talking about. And in this case, we want to measure it. What even is biodiversity? We can talk later about why it's important, but let's understand what it is first. So different ways to kind of think about how we might measure and quantify the variety and the number of living things. It would be very difficult to just say count everything, right? Where do you start? Where do you stop even in that? And that really is like an unattainable thing to do. So hang on just a second here. So here's some images of scientists doing biodiversity studies. A couple of these are local images here from the Northern Oregon coast, actually. Oregon State University, OSU, does a lot of biodiversity studies. So Oregon State does a lot of studies in our tide pool regions. intertidal areas, looking at various things like the shellfish, mussels, beds, the effect of sea stars on them. Recently, we went through the sea star wasting disease, where a lot of the ochre sea star, Pisaster ocraceus, most common kind of purple-orange sea star that we have in our tide pools, was heavily hammered, 90% plus loss in some areas by this new virus that had emerged. And so OSU took that as an opportunity to really study the impact that these species had on intertidal areas, the loss of them, and then as they come back, as they repopulate, as they rebound from this disease, how that changes tide pool ecosystems over time. So that's a pretty interesting opportunity and some studies that have gone on there. So they're looking at the variety of living things in here, the numbers, and how that changes over time. Forest, of course, it's a really important thing terrestrially on land to look at biodiversity, the number and the variety of living things within an ecosystem. This helps us better manage the forest, just for the forest themselves, for the trees and the plants, but also especially for the wildlife and the animals that depend on those different plants and the variety of plants that are there in our forest ecosystems. Okay. So there are a number of different techniques that scientists use, and I'm going to go through 3 of those. I have linked up here a PDF that goes through, I believe, about 5 different methods. If you go to college and study biology, and specifically study field biology, which is what I did, you'll have to take a ecological sampling course. And this is a 400/500 level course. It's a pretty tough course. It uses a lot of statistics, and a lot of advanced mathematics are applied in this class. So it's a fun one. It's a tough one. There'll be a lot of graduate students in there who are actually working on projects. So at least the course I took, the level of learning in that course was pretty high. It was fun. So the first method used for measuring biodiversity is transect sampling, and this is where you would take a rope or a tape measure that's marked out, and at set intervals, so I would go a certain distance, and then at that distance I would stop, whatever it is, no matter what is there. I'm not looking to find things, I'm looking to record what is there. So I would go every 3 feet, let's say, and I would stop. And then at that mark, I would record whatever was touching the line, right? This would be, more specifically, it would be a line intercept or line intersect. And whatever's touching there, I would record that particular species. This is used in plant studies quite a bit, in vegetation studies. This is used in coral reef sampling in tropical reefs. Divers, and I've done this before, do sampling, and they try to do the same transect every year. So I'll do the same line. So you have a fixed line, or you have fixed markers underwater. Maybe that's just a marker that you pound into the rocks. Maybe it's a GPS point, but usually it's a marker. And then you'd attach a line to it from point to point, going from here to here. And every year you'd come back and do that, and you would, mark what you would see along that line, seeing if biodiversity is stable, if it's increasing, or if it's decreasing, and you want to figure out why you see those trends. It's done in transect sampling is done in intertidal areas as well. So you just go along, and every 3 feet, every 1 feet, it really depends, 1 foot, you would stop and then record what is there, right? And how many are there at that particular point of intercept. So that's transect sampling. Another type of sampling is quadrat sampling. Fancy word, right? But what you're really doing is taking a 4-sided square, right? Or 4-sided thing, and then it's a ring. It's usually a fixed area. A lot of times they're made out of plastic or PVC, or in this case wire, but PVC is probably the more common one. And you're going to go out into an area, and really you're going to randomly kind of place this. You either measure out the area and then use a random number generator to decide where you put it, or you can kind of blind throw it. There's a number of different methods for selecting the area. Usually they're about 1 meter squared, but in some cases you'll do something big, like a 20-meter square, where you'd measure out a rope with stakes, and you'd count every single thing that is in there. Not only what species, but how many are in that square. So this is used in plant work a lot, in vegetation work. And so you're wanting to really get at not just, what species are there, but the different numbers, what we would call the abundance or the species richness in that area. So you would count in one square, and then you move on to another one. You do this throughout the particular area where you're sampling until you feel like you have a good representation of what is in that area. You're not going to get everything by any of these methods, but you're going to get pretty close to it, and you're going to get a good statistical number of what is actually happening in the environment. And that's the idea behind this in order to measure. Now, something that biologists do as well is we use netting. So if you're wanting to count and really measure birds, bats, especially in water, they do this with fish, of course, use a fine mesh net, and you set it up for a particular period of time, and you try to do this at the same time every day, or if you come back and do it the next year, you want to do it at the same time every year in the same location. So you have a fixed area where you work. Every year you're going to do it at this time of day on these dates, and you're going to go back. And you're going to actually be capturing the animals in this case. They're going to fly into and get caught in the net. So the net is only temporarily set up. It's never left up. You set it up, you capture, and then you identify. So you write down what species you have. You measure. We almost always measure them. We measure the size, the weight, other things like that. Just depends on the particular organism you're measuring. Most of the time, since you capture something, you want to mark it with some type of marking. With birds, there are the little bands that you put around their legs, and they have numbers on them, like a license plate. And then you record down the number, and when you caught that bird, and the species, the weight, if you can, the sex of the bird, etc., with all the other information about where you caught it, and then you'll release it. If the bird is ever caught in a different location, well, then that can be compared, especially nowadays with computer databases. You can say, oh my gosh, this bird was caught here in Oregon, and then it was caught in Costa Rica the following winter, and this happens commonly. So we use this to then look at and study migration and other things as well beyond just biodiversity. So this data can be applied to a wider set. And blood and tissue can often be taken for genetic sampling as well. And I've done this a lot with birds. The little toolbox, fishing box you see here next to us has all of the different tools we have for measurement, banding, and even blood sampling within it. So this is me right here working with a kittiwake, probably a red-legged kittiwake, and this is a small gull-type bird. This particular red-legged kittiwake's species of bird, they only live in 4 islands in the entire world. The Aleutians have some of the biggest biodiversity for seabirds, in the entire northern hemisphere. One of the islands I worked on had over 30 species of seabird breeding on the island alone, and over 10 million individuals on the island itself. So huge diversity in some of these areas and abundance. This is me on one of those Aleutian islands as well, getting a parakeet auklet out of a mist net. They come out at night, so for these we would set up our nets starting at around 1 in the morning and then working until about 3 or 4 in the morning, catching birds that would fly in at night. Okay, so now we've seen how we measure. The next question is, what do we measure? So you've seen different methods that we can go out and collect data. You can use that transect where you walk along at every fixed amount of distance. You stop and just see what's there. You can use the quadrats, which is a little square that you just kind of throw out and you count everything within it. Or you could use nets as well to capture flying species or in a river swimming species, and then count those and then release them afterwards. What are we counting, though? We're counting 2 different factors. So the first one is called species richness or variety. This is the number of different species in an area. So when we're measuring biodiversity, if we say it has high biodiversity, what does that mean? Or if we say it has low? Well, one way to quantify that is to say it has high species richness. It has a high variety. In other words, there's a bunch of different species in that area, a high number of them. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little tour here. Let me stand up. So I'm in my backyard here. There's some of my neighbors. There's my place. And if you look over here, I'm going to make you a little bit sick maybe, sorry. My lawn. Woo-hoo. Hey, there's my lawn. There is a lot of stuff going on here. There's a lot of plants. But the variety, the species richness, is really low. It's just basically 1 or 2 species of grass. Over here, in this area, I had kind of the same deal going. And then I cut out a lot of this invasive reed canary grass and blackberry. And then as you can see, I planted a lot of native plants back in here. So what I'm trying to do back in here is increase the species richness, increase the number of different plant species. Hey there. That I have in my backyard, and increase the overall biodiversity and the health of the ecosystem. That's the idea. Okay. The other is then species diversity or abundance. The amount of individuals, right, of each species in an area. So what I'm looking at here is really like how many, not just blades of grass are in the area, or how many spirea plants are in the area, but or not the variety, but how many of each are in the area is what I'm trying to get at here. So the species diversity, or the abundance of those. So I'm really looking now at, right, how many of those individuals are actually there. So I might have what I would say is like a high variety, but when you really look at it, you could still have low diversity or abundance within that. And if you look at these two diagrams, we're going to compare two different plant communities here, and this will start to make sense to you. So looking at these, which one of these has a higher species richness or variety? In other words, which one of these has the highest number of different types of species? The answer to that is they're both identical. These both have the same number of different types of species in them. So this is made up of, this is a community. It's made up of 4 different species. It's made up of tree species A, or population A, population B, population C, and population D, right? Let's say a maple, an alder, a fir, and a spruce. Okay, so it's got all 4 of those in there in that area. This one here has the same 4 species. Look, right in here. This one has A, right, B, C, and D. It has all 4 of them. Okay, so if we just looked at variety, they're both the same. But if we look at the diversity, in other words, how diverse is this group actually? What is the abundance of these different species? In this one, what we're going to do is count the number of individuals of each species and then compare those up. And what we'll find is that comparing these two, right, this one has a higher diversity than this one here. This bottom one, community 2, is dominated by one type of tree species. Species A dominates. It makes up 80% of the population, right? And then B and C are only 5%, and D is only 10% right here. So much lower overall species diversity or abundance in community 2 than in community 1. So which one is more biodiverse, right? High biodiversity is best calculated by having a higher species diversity or abundance when comparing different communities. If we just looked at the species richness or variety, that number, it would be the same for both. But if we actually calculate out the species diversity or abundance, then we'll find out we would have a different number here, right? And so we would use the biodiversity number for 1, which will come out to be a higher value. And if you click on the link here, measured by 2 main factors, I hyperlinked in an article that goes over these and shows you the actual statistical calculation for how to do this. I'm not going to go over that here because most of you probably watching this just don't have the math skills yet to be able to really understand it or unpack that. But there is a calculation you can do, and you could measure this quantifiably, come up with a number, and compare these 2 ecosystems. Right. And then you could have a discussion about, well, what do we do to maybe increase diversity in this one, or is it natural, right, that we have a dominant species? In many ecosystems, you do have a dominant species as well. But in the case of like my backyard, where I had canary grass and blackberries that came in as invasive species, they took over, and we'll talk about that in a second, and really lowered the overall diversity and abundance of this yard, and just doesn't supply food for birds, nesting habitat, and things like that, or maybe only for one type of bird. So I'm trying to increase the overall biodiversity by increasing not just the richness, but I planted in my backyard a few of each different kind of species of native types. Here's another example. Community A, Community B. Which one is more biodiverse? If we looked at just variety and species richness, we'd see that they both are equal in the variety of species they have. They each have 4. But if we looked at species diversity and abundance, we would see that Community B is more biodiverse. Okay. And then looking down at the photo here, both species richness and diversity are low in this picture here, obviously. Now, here in Oregon and really in the United States in general, and in any society that cares about its forest, they would replant this. The question is, what would they replant it with, and how long would it take for it to come back? And when managing forest, we just need to always remember that if we are going to be clear cutting, we need to have areas that we are not clear cutting so that wildlife and other things can be sustained over time, and we need to kind of have a balance of each of those impacted and not impacted ecosystems. So global biodiversity on a global level, right? We're looking at the species numbers, just the numbers of different species, and this is of plants. So which areas have the most species? The highest numbers are in red, and then the purples, and then brown to greens and whites. So we can see right here that the tropical regions have the highest number of plant species in them, right? The greatest variety, right, in this case. And what are we talking about here? Are we talking about variety or abundance? This map is species numbers, so we're talking about variety or species richness in these particular habitats. And then as you go north and south, you see that the variety of species decreases. Here on this map, what we're looking at on this one here is a similar thing, and I believe this one is vertebrates, or things with backbones. And so the diversity of consumers directly follows that of producers, which we just saw on the other slide. So super high diversity of things with backbones, vertebrates in here, and basically, animals and things like that. Amphibians, frogs alone in the tropics. It's an incredible diversity. Whereas if you get up here where we are, we have, a good, but nothing comparable to the tropical regions as far as their biodiversity goes. Okay, and in this graphic here, we are looking at number of, I believe this one is just amphibians as well, number of species. And again, looking at the tropics down in here, you've got some really high numbers for those. And drops off to pretty much none up in here. I believe there is one amphibian that can survive up in Alaska. It goes dormant for part of the year, and it's got like antifreeze for blood or something whack like that. It's pretty cool. Okay. And in our area, I just wanted to kind of highlight and show you guys, the biodiversity here is really high in the Pacific Northwest. In our temperate coniferous rainforest, that's our particular ecosystem that we live in. Of course, there's all kinds of sub-ecosystems and smaller ones. It's not just one big generic one. If you go into a river, it's a different ecosystem. Or even alongside a stream, the riparian zone that contains alders and willow and maple is different than you'd find up on a ridge where you'd have Douglas fir or cedar, and then different from a coastal forest where you'd have, hemlock or spruce. The overall ecosystem, temperate coniferous rainforest, has a huge variety of species here. And this is just salamanders alone that can occur here in just the coast range. So just, from the headwaters of the Trask River down to, the lowlands, you've got all of these variety of salamanders that occur here. Most of you aren't familiar with them, but they're here. If you go out in a stream and you start just kind of in a clear, cool running stream, start flipping over some rocks, you'll see salamanders shoot out that have gills, and they're juvenile forms of these. And they occur in the forest under logs. Western redback is a real common one. Pacific giant salamanders come out at night. And then some of these live in canopies. Clouded salamanders do. We're all familiar with rough-skinned newts. They're pretty common here. But it really depends, on the particular type of habitat you're in within our ecosystem, where you're going to find these different ones. These all occur here, and I've seen most of these in the Coast Range around here. Okay, last thing here is going to be negative impacts on ecosystems, and then on biodiversity. And I'm thinking globally, but I'm also thinking locally here. So what are some of the things that especially humans can do to lower biodiversity, or that can happen to an ecosystem to cause biodiversity to lower from where it's at? Seasonally, biodiversity lowers in the winter than it does in the summer. Animals migrate. That's one. But I'm thinking more in the longer term thing. So destruction or removal of the entire community. By entire community, I mean not just one population. We're talking everything in that, except for the abiotic factors, right? You're stripping it down to bare soil to a certain degree. So this can be development, urbanization, right? We're going to go in and just do a housing development here. We're basically going to take out anything natural, strip it down to dirt, throw in some topsoil, build houses, and then plant a bunch of non-native plants. Urbanization, build a parking lot. Or a shopping mall, that pretty much zeroes things out. Converting land to agriculture. And so you're going to take all the native species that are in this area, and basically we're just going to take them off, and then we're going to put in, crops and things like that. It's not that there's anything wrong with planting crops or agriculture at all. I'm just saying this does local biodiversity lower. So this is something we have to take into account when we talk about managing our regional biodiversity, right? We can't do this to every square inch. We got to leave some areas. And so what does that look like? Where do we leave? What are important areas to leave, right? Maybe we want to measure that biodiversity in as many places as possible, identify the really important, most biodiverse ones that have the most species, and leave those as sort of seed beds for the area around us as well. Strip mining, that's just basically removing everything off the top of the ground and going at what's underneath. This is not just like drilling a mine shaft and digging underground. This is kind of digging huge holes in the earth. We don't do as much of that here. It happens in Nevada and the deserts. I don't know of a lot of strip mining in Oregon. Southern Oregon, there's been some in the past historically in the Siskiyous. Okay, and clear cutting either for logging or for firewood. We don't have as big of a firewood issue here, but in other third world countries where there's no electricity, there's no way to cook food other than firewood, generations of communities going out and just basically logging to get firewood have decimated some ecosystems and pushed forests, just wiped out forests completely in these areas. Okay. And then you can see I linked a video here to the Amazon rainforest. It's a really good explainer, about 12 minutes long, that goes over the fires in the Amazon and the impacts that humans have had in the Amazon, constantly encroaching on that ecosystem. This is what this is a picture of here, is clear cutting, complete deforestation of the tropics. Which area is going to be more biodiverse? That's a no duh. Removal of populations within communities. So we're not taking out the entire communities, right? Or community. We're not taking out, every population, but we're going to go after select ones. In areas where there is over-harvesting of one particular thing, that could be a plant or an animal, and really what we're talking about here is basically, in essence, poaching, or where there is no regulations. So it wouldn't even be poaching because there's no rules in the book anyway. Many species have been removed this way. Think of your big majestic mammals. All of your sort of big majestic mammals in different parts of the world are under attack. We do a good job in this country. We do a fantastic job with managing our species. We have hunting rules and regulations, and almost everybody follows those, and rightfully so. And this ensures that we're not wiping out our forest or eliminating a particular species. That they'll be around and that they're sustainable. But especially in the tropics, in places in Africa, a lot of big game animals are under constant attack from poaching. Certain species are on the brink of extinction right now. Because of this. So this lowers overall biodiversity. And from the air, you might look down and look at a jungle and see that the plant communities are still intact. But what's going on underneath is a big drop in biodiversity. Okay, pollution. Pollution is really destroying a particular community or a particular population by introducing abiotic elements that are toxic. So, this isn't biotic interactions. This is abiotic on biotic. This is us putting chemicals and other things either into the air, water, or the ground, or either unearthing those chemicals. Sometimes strip mining. You'll mine out a certain area, and then the piles of some of the heavy metals that they pull out of the ground, and they pile up in these what they call tailings. Rain will come along and it'll leach the chemicals from these strip mines out into the area surrounding it and really just poison everything around it in the entire watershed at times. So this can have a big effect. Of course, putting pollution in the air and things like that. Unregulated dumping and all those types of things can have a really gnarly effect on ecosystems. And I think everybody's in agreement with the idea that polluting your ecosystem is a terrible idea, and we should do everything we can to stop or at least mitigate that so that we don't destroy it. Okay, another way to lower biodiversity is the introduction of invasive species. So bring in a species that isn't local to the area and introduce it to the local ecosystem, and then it takes off. In our area, we have blackberries, Himalayan blackberries. We have reed canary grass. We have English ivy. I'm looking down just around me here. I'm doing a lot of work in my yard trying to get rid of a lot of these species and bring in some native species. A lot of them are plants. Animals, I can't think of any in our particular area, but in other places there's been introduced fish or even invertebrates. Oh, we have green crabs in the bays, which are a big problem here. Moon snails are a problem here. And in other places where animals like mongooses have been introduced to Hawaii, have just wreaked havoc on bird populations there. Cats in New Zealand, house cats. The birds, there was no mammals in New Zealand, and now people have brought in mammals, and there's like flightless parrots and other birds, kiwis, that have no defense against these predators, and so they really do wreak havoc and lower biodiversity on those populations. So those are the negative impacts that I could think of. Really looking at, taking out an entire community, obviously bad. Removing a population within a community, selecting sort of certain populations because we want them. Pollution, introducing abiotic elements, and then bringing in a non-native species and kind of letting it just run roughshod throughout the environment. Okay, this is the last slide, and I just kind of came up with my own reason, but I want you to think about yours. Why care? Who cares? What is the concern with the global or regional loss in biodiversity? More and more, we spend a lot of time inside on devices, on phones. We don't go outside. We don't connect with the earth. Who cares? We practically live in a virtual world in many ways. So what does it matter, honestly, except for some hippie like me sitting in my yard and you can hear all the birds around me. Why is this important, though? And I think it's an important question to ask. I think it's important that you come up with your own answer. I have supplied you with mine. Ultimately, it's a question you need to answer for yourself, right? And I couldn't come up with a short one, so I came up with a long one. But I think in our area, I grew up in coastal Oregon, southern Oregon, and we define ourselves in this part of the world by the richness of our ecosystems, right? We define ourselves by having really awesome, amazing, clean, clear rivers that we can swim in, and in the summertime that salmon come back to every year in large numbers, that people come from all over to go fishing here for these fish. We have elk herds, we have deer. In our bays, we have clams and oysters and in abundance, and we feel good eating them because we know the water's clean again. And every single organism within all of this is what makes that what it is. We may not be able to identify or understand the role of every organism. We may not care about some microbe or some worm, but it's going to be tied to what we do care about. It's going to be tied to the clams and the crabs and the fish and the salmon coming back and the baby salmon having food to eat. And all of this is tied together whether or not we understand it or appreciate it. And every time we remove a species, every time we remove a population, or worse yet, when something goes extinct, because when it's extinct, it's gone forever. We're never going to see it again. It's a drawing, it's a photograph, it's a video, but it's lost and gone. We make this less like Earth and more like Mars. We make it less a place where you can go sit outside and relax, and more like you're standing in the middle of a parking garage in downtown Portland. To me, that's not a very relaxing place to chill. We make it less of a place where you want to go out and play when you're a kid. My kids love playing in this backyard. I love playing, when I was a kid, and more like some rubbly lot with broken cinder blocks and rebar sticking out of the ground where you're worried you're going to get tetanus at every turn. So for me, right, I want to, even if I'm not appreciating it every day, I want to be able to go outside and know that I'm living in a place that is diverse, that's healthy, and where my kids can grow up and kind of live in that. That sounds cliche, doesn't it? But it's true. It's so true. And that's important to me. That's important to me, and it's important to think all of our identity here, on the Oregon coast, and hopefully on planet Earth in general, right? That we don't end up living in some kind of smogged out cubicle, in some giant parking lot. Anyway, that's my pitch. That's what biodiversity is. Have fun with the note sheet, and email me if you have any questions, man. That's about it. Later, y'all.